Hi, my name is Andy Minter, and this is my video response number one. So I'm going to start out by defining disaster. So disaster has a very widespread effect on community. Obviously, it can impact not only the individuals living in the community, but those beyond it as well. We live in a day and age of widespread technology, media is everywhere. You have the ability to find out what's going on halfway across the world. So it's very easy for secondary communities to experience vicarious trauma as a result of witnessing a disaster in a community nearby. Disaster is defined in the fundamentals of crisis counseling as natural or human caused catastrophe that causes destruction, frequently including loss of life, with permanent changes to an environment and a community. And I think this permanent changes aspect is really what sets disasters apart from crises. A disaster is all encompassing. It has effects at a community level rather than a more personal individual one. It can be anything from a fire to a mass shooting, a hurricane, or obviously, as we've recently experienced, a pandemic. And these are different from crises in the sense that they have the capability to impact all areas of somebody's life, and they operate more at a community level. A lot of people experience the trauma as a result of the disaster, whereas crisis is more individual. People can lose loved ones, possessions, any sense of stability or belonging. It affects all areas of a person's life. So this is kind of where the definition in the video that we're referencing, the stages of disaster video, they define collective trauma as a blow to the basic tissues of social life that damages the bonds attaching people together and impairs the prevailing sense of community. So in dealing with somebody that has just experienced a disaster, if you were speaking to them, I think it's really important to help them understand that their response to this kind of disaster and trauma is valid and completely expected. As was emphasized in our psychological first aid training, which I saw a lot of overlaps between that and the stages of disaster video, which is pretty cool. But they really emphasized that social support is one of the foundational necessities in recovery from disaster. It's the most predictive of post-traumatic and disaster resiliency, and it's difficult because a disaster truly tears apart the foundations of a community. However, the widespread impact of a disaster can also be the thing that brings a community back together. This can be particularly true for communities of racial and ethnic minority groups. However, they may also face greater barriers as they may be smaller, more fragile, or more easily disrupted. I think I personally witnessed the kind of resiliency effects that disaster can have on a community. I lived in Houston when Harvey hit, and it was really cool to see. There was so much pride in Houston because everyone from all corners of the community came together to support each other. So while there are a lot of obviously negative impacts of a disaster, that kind of post-traumatic resiliency is a very key element. Disasters obviously can have monumental impacts on an individual's mental well-being. So a survivor may experience a wide range of issues: depression, anxiety, general psychological distress, suicidality, substance abuse, and PTSD are extremely common in terms of recovery from a disaster. And such significant loss will undoubtedly affect an individual's mental well-being as they try to cope with the disaster. So our psychological first aid training referenced kind of three groups in terms of coping with disaster in the aftermath. So first of all, there's the eustress group. This group is a lot more higher functioning. They're a lot more positive, able to bounce back a lot faster. They don't require as much care. Secondly, there is the distress group. So this group is experiencing some mild symptoms of the negative impacts that can happen after a disaster. So this could be anything like temporary confusion, fear, irritability, temporary phobic avoidance, or they might start to question their spirituality and kind of turn away from that. And then finally, there is the most extreme group and this is the group of dysfunction. and they require a lot of care, probably a higher level of care than psychological first aid can really help with, but they might have stronger reactions like hallucinations, panic attacks, aggression or violence, self-medication, or they may kind of turn away from all faith-related practices, or conversely, really try to project their own faith onto other people. So these categorizing these levels of responses into 3 groups kind of helps us as, learning counselors identify who needs what kind of help. But despite all the negative impacts that it can have, as noted by Gingrich and Gingrich, disasters can increase personal resilience and enhance social and community resilience as well. So now kind of delving into the stages of disaster response video, they really broke it down into 6 stages. So the first is pre-disaster, followed by the actual disaster itself. This is followed by the heroic phase, then the honeymoon phase, the disillusionment phase, and finally the reconstruction phase. So let's break these down a little bit. In the pre-disaster phase, this is obviously before the disaster hits. People may or may not be planning for it. There's some disasters that you can kind of anticipate, like hurricanes, so there's some preparation that can go into that. However, there's others like a fire or an earthquake or a mass shooting is a good example that you really can't prepare for. But during this phase, people, even if they are aware that a disaster is coming, they aren't always a good judge of anticipating the magnitude of what it could be. I know a lot of times when we get hurricane warnings, it could be like a category 5 or a category 1, and so you kind of don't necessarily know how to respond to it prior to the actual disaster itself. So that moves us into the disaster phase. And this can be over in 10 minutes, or it can be a very prolonged event. In the case of Hurricane Katrina, that kind of thing takes effect over days and days. Or if you look at the pandemic, that could arguably be extended over months. And so you really have to look at the disaster responses for the survivors over that period of time. Moving on from the disaster phase, we move into the heroic phase. So this is kind of the initial level of response and extraordinary support efforts that are put in by the community, by surrounding communities. This is kind of where all the media attention first hits. This is when first responders are super active. It's a lot of the initial help after the disaster. I know this kind of brought to mind recently when Russia first invaded Ukraine. It was a global response. I saw flags and Instagram posts and just this outpouring of support. And this is characteristic of the initial heroic phase. Moving on, we move into the honeymoon phase. And this is where people really start to feel the effects of that initial support. They start to feel encouraged. They start to feel like, maybe everything might turn out all right. The resources that have been poured in, the money, the effects of the first responders, really everything starts to kind of take root. And I feel like this phase is categorized by a sense of general hope and just kind of rebuilding the community. Moving on from here, we go into the disillusionment phase. So this is kind of where a lot of the initial support has started to taper off, and the magnitude of this disaster really starts to sink in, and the impact of what this has done to your world. It's kind of a harsh reality. So this is where we can also see different communities affected in different ways. The example they gave in the stages of disaster video was that some communities experienced a lot more support than others in the wake of Katrina. So this phase is also characterized by a decrease in the number of contributions. Media attention's kind of waned. People are moving on to whatever next disaster has occurred, and so that community is kind of feeling like withdrawals from that initial support. Some organizations might start to pull out and invest their money elsewhere, and just this kind of general feeling of despair starts to set in. And then following this, we move into the last phase of reconstruction. So reconstruction is where people really start to rebuild the community. And this can honestly be for the better sometimes. I know I was thinking about it in terms of the pandemic. In the wake of the pandemic, we have started to put so many more new protocols and health orders in place that has made our community better than what it was, and hopefully help us prepare should a similar disaster, another pandemic, strike in the future. So it gives people the opportunity to do things different and even better. So what does a counselor's involvement look like throughout this process? Counselors may find themselves in positions where they have to work in a disaster scenario, but flexibility and rapport are two of the most crucial elements. Miller emphasized that a counselor needs to have the capacity to develop relationships with others as well as a capacity for flexibility. The counselor has to remain cognizant of the individual's needs in the moment and should not approach the situation with any sort of agenda. So, in conclusion, I've included the following resources in my response. The first is Developing Cultural Competence in Disaster Mental Health Programs by Jean Athey and Jean Moody Williams, and it was provided by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. I also included the Psychological First Aid course that we took by Johns Hopkins University, taught by George Everly. Treating Trauma in Christian Counseling by Heather Gingrich and Fred Gingrich. The Fundamentals of Crisis Counseling by Jerry Miller, and finally, obviously, the Stages of Disaster video provided by Houston Christian University. Thank you.